In a world where love and betrayal can collide in the most unexpected ways, Sarah thought she was about to begin the happiest chapter of her life. But on her wedding day, everything changed. What was meant to be a dream turned into a nightmare, as shocking secrets unraveled and nothing was what it seemed. This is a story of love, trust, and the courage to face the truth, even when it feels like your heart is shattering. Now, let's begin this unforgettable journey. Sarah had imagined this moment for as long as she could remember. From the moment she first played dress-up with her childhood friends, to those late-night talks with her mother about finding the one, she had always known that her wedding day would be a fairy tale. Today, that dream was becoming a reality. The church was beyond beautiful. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, lilies, roses, and delicate white orchids, arranged meticulously around every pillar and pew. Soft music played in the background, the melody of a string quartet echoing throughout the room, setting a tone of serenity and elegance. Candles flickered at every corner, casting a soft golden glow over the entire space. It was as if time had slowed, as if nothing in the world existed except for Sarah, her dress, and the man she loved standing at the altar. She looked down at her gown, an intricate masterpiece of lace and satin. The fabric shimmered with every step she took, making her feel like she was floating down the aisle. As her father walked her toward the front of the church, the eyes of their guests followed her every move. Sarah could feel the weight of their gazes, but it didn't matter. This was her moment. She was marrying Jack, the love of her life, her soulmate. She could hardly believe it was happening. Jack stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on her. He looked every bit the handsome groom, his tailored suit making him look both timeless and modern, his dark hair neatly combed, his face soft with the gentle smile that she had fallen in love with. The warmth in his gaze made her heart race, and for a moment, she felt like the only two people in the world. The ceremony had begun. The vows were about to be exchanged. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for, the moment she would step into the next chapter of her life, of their life together. Her father's hand rested on her arm, steady and comforting, as they reached the front. But as they approached the altar, something in the air changed. There was a slight shift, a subtle tension in the room that Sarah couldn't quite place. She brushed it off, convincing herself it was nothing, just the nerves, just the weight of the moment. But as Jack's smile grew wider, as the minister began to speak, a strange, almost uncomfortable feeling began to rise in Sarah's chest. It was as if something was off. A small voice in the back of her mind whispered that something wasn't quite right. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She blinked, trying to push the feeling away, trying to focus on Jack, on the love they shared. She could see the look in his eyes, the sincerity in his smile. He was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had ever dreamed of. But the unease didn't leave. It lingered, heavy and uninvited, making it hard to breathe. She felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her stomach churning as if the ground beneath her feet were shifting. Her eyes darted to the guests seated in the pews, their faces a mix of joy and admiration. But it wasn't their faces that unsettled her. It was the stillness, the way everything seemed too perfect, too curated. Everything was supposed to be perfect, wasn't it? She had spent months planning, ensuring that every detail was just right. So why did she feel like something was about to go horribly wrong? She glanced at Jack again, seeking comfort in his presence, in the way he stood so confident, so at ease. He was supposed to be the anchor in this moment, the one who calmed her nerves, the one who made everything feel right. But as her gaze locked with his, Sarah saw something, just a flicker, something she couldn't quite explain. It was there, and gone so quickly, but it was enough to make her pulse quicken, enough to make her question everything. And then, in the quietest of moments, just as the minister was about to speak the sacred words of the ceremony, the church doors swung open with a loud crash. The sudden noise reverberated through the room, startling everyone in its wake. Heads turned. Guests gasped. The music faltered and stopped. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the bright sunlight streaming in behind them. A man, tall, with wild, unkempt hair and an intense look on his face. His eyes were locked on Jack, his mouth moving, though no sound came out at first. Sarah could see the fury in his eyes, the tension in his stance. He moved toward the altar with purpose, his eyes never leaving Jack's, his expression twisted with anger. Jack's face went pale, his smile faltering for the first time. His hand twitched slightly, as if he was about to move toward the man, but then he froze. The church had fallen into stunned silence. Sarah felt like the world had stopped. Every single person in that room was waiting, holding their breath. "Jack!" The man's voice finally broke through the silence, raw with emotion. "You can't just leave me like this. Not now. Not after everything." Sarah's heart began to race, her chest tightening as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was this man? And why was he so angry? Was he a friend? An ex? What was going on? Jack stood motionless, his face now a mix of guilt and sorrow. He looked from the man to Sarah, his eyes pleading, but Sarah was too stunned to understand. The air around her felt suffocating, as if the walls of the church were closing in. She turned to her father, hoping for some sense of guidance, but his grip on her arm had tightened, his face a mirror of confusion and concern. And then, before Sarah could gather herself, the man stepped forward, his voice rising in a painful crescendo. "How could you do this to me, Jack? After everything we've been through?" Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs, her breath shallow. She stared at the man, her thoughts racing. This wasn't just a random interruption. This was personal. This was about Jack. And Sarah realized, with growing horror, that everything she thought she knew was about to come crashing down. The wedding she had dreamed of, the life she had planned, was it all a lie? As Sarah made her way down the aisle, her father's strong, reassuring hand on her arm was the only thing grounding her. The guests stood in silence, their faces awash with smiles, their eyes glistening with admiration and joy. She was radiant, glowing with happiness as she gazed ahead at Jack, who stood at the altar, waiting for her. His warm smile was a beacon of everything she had hoped for. This was it, the day she had dreamed of, the culmination of years of love and anticipation. Her heart fluttered, a feeling of euphoria lifting her spirit higher with each step. It felt surreal. It was as if she were walking through a dream, one that she didn't want to end. Jack's eyes never left her. She could feel the depth of his affection, his love, radiating towards her from across the space. There was something about his gaze that made everything feel like it was falling into place. As Sarah reached the altar, she could already imagine the rest of her life unfolding in front of her. A life filled with laughter, shared moments, and endless love. The ceremony began, the minister's voice echoing through the cathedral, each word carrying weight, setting the stage for the vows they were about to exchange. Sarah could hardly wait to say those words that would bind her to Jack forever. But as the minister spoke, a strange, almost electric sensation coursed through her. Her nerves, once masked by excitement, began to shift into something darker, something unfamiliar. She shook her head slightly, trying to brush it off, but the feeling clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. And then it happened. Without warning, the heavy wooden doors of the church flew open with an ear-splitting bang, cutting through the serene atmosphere like a knife. The guests gasped, their heads whipping toward the entrance. Sarah's heart lurched in her chest. It felt like the room had frozen in time. The music stuttered, faltering mid-note. A heavy silence blanketed the church, broken only by the sound of hurried footsteps. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and imposing. The sunlight from outside poured in behind him, casting a shadow that stretched long across the marble floor. His face was a storm of raw emotion, anger, pain, and something else. The intensity in his expression made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. He was seething, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes blazing with fury. Every step he took towards the altar seemed deliberate, calculated, and filled with purpose. Sarah's body went rigid. Who was this man? What was happening? The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers spreading like wildfire. No one knew who he was, but the look on his face told them all they needed to know. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He was here for something that felt far too personal. The man's gaze locked onto Jack. There was no mistaking the recognition in their eyes, the connection between them that was palpable in the charged air. Sarah felt her chest tighten, her mind racing to catch up with the surreal scene unfolding before her. The man's eyes were filled with a mix of rage and hurt, raw, unfiltered emotion that made Sarah's stomach churn. "Jack!" The man's voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy silence like a whip. "You can't do this! You can't just walk away from me!" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak beneath her, as if the very ground she stood on had shifted. She glanced at Jack, seeking some kind of explanation, but the look on his face was one she couldn't read. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with what could only be described as shock or fear. But there was something else there too. Guilt, perhaps? Sarah couldn't tell, but in that moment, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The intruder took another step forward, his movements tense, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "How could you do this to me, Jack?" he spat, his voice breaking with emotion. "After everything we've been through, everything we shared, you can't just pretend like none of it ever happened." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Shared? What did he mean by that? She had never seen this man before, and yet there he was, confronting Jack with a history that Sarah knew nothing about. Her mind spun, her thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and dread. What was he talking about? What history did Jack have with him? And why had Jack never mentioned him before? Jack stood frozen, his eyes flickering from the man to Sarah and back again. There was a flash of something dark in his expression. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had always known Jack had a past, but she had never imagined it was something like this. The look on his face told her that this wasn't just a random encounter. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was personal. "Who is he, Jack?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his face desperately for answers. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to falter, trapped in his throat. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight with indecision. The tension in the room was unbearable. The guests were silent, their gazes fixed on the scene before them. It was as if no one dared to breathe. The man didn't wait for Jack to speak. Instead, he turned his gaze back to Sarah, his expression softening just slightly. "You deserve to know the truth, Sarah," he said, his voice low, but filled with a strange mixture of sadness and regret. "Jack isn't who he appears to be, not the man you think he is." The words hit Sarah like a wave crashing over her. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Everything he's told you about his past, about his life before you, it's all lies," the man continued, his voice breaking with the weight of his revelation. "We've been through so much together, and now he's throwing it all away for a dream, for a future that he doesn't deserve." The room seemed to close in on Sarah, the walls pressing tighter around her. Her heart was racing, her mind a whirlwind of questions and fear. How could this be happening? How could Jack, the man she loved, the man she had trusted with her heart, have kept something like this from her? Jack took a step forward, his voice breaking the stillness. "Please, let me explain," he said, but his words were drowned out by the man's next outburst. "No, Jack, you don't get to explain. Not after what you've done." The man's voice was raw, filled with betrayal. "Not after you promised me everything and then abandoned me, and now you're going to marry her? You think she'll ever know the truth? You think she'll love you when she finds out who you really are?" The words stung like a slap, each one driving into Sarah's heart, each one chipping away at the perfect future she had imagined. The dream wedding, the dream life, all of it was crumbling in front of her, piece by piece. Her gaze flickered to Jack, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's he talking about, Jack?" Jack looked at her then, his eyes full of anguish, but there was something else there, something Sarah couldn't ignore. Fear. Fear of what the truth might do to her, to their life together. And as much as he wanted to deny it, as much as he wanted to reassure her, Sarah knew deep down that the truth was darker than she could ever have imagined. The man took one final step toward the altar, his eyes locked on Jack's. "She deserves to know the truth. The real truth, Jack, before it's too late." And with those words, the world around Sarah shattered. The dream wedding, the perfect day, the love she had thought was unshakable, everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The future she had imagined now seemed impossible, and the man standing at the altar beside her suddenly felt like a stranger. The man's voice echoed like thunder through the church, causing the guests to jump in their seats. His words rang with such raw, desperate emotion that it felt like the air itself had thickened with tension. "How could you do this to me, Jack?" he yelled, his voice cracking with pain and fury. The room seemed to freeze in that moment, as if time itself had stopped to listen to the weight of his words. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to Jack, her fingers still trembling in his, but he said nothing. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and fear. He stood there, frozen, unable or unwilling to respond. The man didn't wait for Jack to speak. Instead, he surged forward with a violent, pent-up force. Before Sarah could react, the man grabbed Jack by the collar of his tuxedo, shaking him violently. The sound of fabric tearing echoed in the tense silence, adding to the chaos of the moment. "Tell her the truth, Jack!" the man demanded, his voice seething with anger, his hands gripping Jack with a force that made Sarah wince. "Tell her what you've done. Tell her about us." Sarah's pulse quickened. Her stomach churned as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The man's eyes were filled with an agony that Sarah couldn't understand, but what frightened her more was Jack's silence. He just stood there, his body stiff, his face a mask of emotions she couldn't quite place. Was he guilty? Was he ashamed? Or was there something darker, something more sinister, lurking behind his silence? The man shook Jack again, harder this time, his anger and frustration almost palpable. "You think you can just walk away from everything, from me, from us?" he spat, his voice trembling with betrayal. "You think she'll love you when she knows the truth? Do you honestly believe she can stand by you when she learns what you did?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. She looked around at the guests, their faces painted with shock and disbelief, but no one moved. No one dared to intervene. Everyone was watching the unfolding drama in stunned silence, as if afraid to interrupt the train wreck happening before them. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice low and strained. "Please, stop." His words were barely a whisper, and there was a tremor in his voice that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She could hear the pain in his voice, but it wasn't the reassurance she had hoped for. It wasn't the calm, confident Jack she knew. It was a broken man, on the edge of something terrifying. But the man didn't listen. Instead, he stepped back, his grip on Jack loosening, but still filled with fury. His chest heaved as if he had been holding his breath for too long. "You don't get it, do you, Jack? You've been living a lie, and now you're dragging her into it," he shouted, his voice rising in pitch, his emotions spiraling out of control. Sarah's head was spinning. She couldn't keep up with the revelations, the accusations. Everything she thought she knew about Jack was crumbling around her. She had trusted him. She had loved him with all her heart, believed in their future, their dreams. But now the cracks were starting to show. And those cracks were widening, threatening to swallow everything she had once believed in. "Who are you?" Sarah finally managed to say, her voice barely audible but filled with a raw, trembling desperation. She felt like she was drowning, and she needed to know the truth. She needed to know what had brought this man here, this stranger who seemed to know everything about Jack. The man turned to her, his expression softening for just a moment. There was sadness in his eyes, and a wariness that made him look older than he probably was. "I'm the one Jack left behind," he said quietly, his voice suddenly devoid of the rage it had carried moments before. "I'm the one he walked away from after everything we shared." He paused, as if the weight of the truth was too much for him to bear. "I'm the one who trusted him, loved him, and I'm the one who got thrown away like nothing." The words hit Sarah like a slap. Her knees went weak beneath her, and she had to clutch the altar to steady herself. The world around her spun, her vision blurred by tears she hadn't even realized were welling in her eyes. She looked at Jack, really looked at him, for the first time. And what she saw was not the man she had envisioned spending the rest of her life with. Instead, she saw someone she barely recognized. Jack's face was pale, his lips trembling, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. He avoided her gaze, his eyes flickering to the floor, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. The shame that hung around him was palpable, and Sarah could feel it tightening around her like a noose. For a moment, there was only silence, the heavy weight of the revelation settling over them all. The man, this stranger, took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort. I don't want to ruin your day, Sarah, he said softly, his voice now tinged with a kind of quiet regret. But I can't stand here and let him pretend like nothing happened. Like everything he's been telling you is the truth. Because it's not. Sarah's heart was beating so loudly she could barely hear him. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to confront Jack and make him tell her everything. But the words stuck in her throat. The man had just said the one thing that had never occurred to her, that the man she was about to marry was hiding something. Something dark. Something big. Jack, is this true? She asked, her voice a whisper of the calm it once was. The eyes of everyone in the church were now fixed on him, waiting, breathless. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, as if the weight of the truth was too much for him to carry. When he finally spoke, it was with a tremor that sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. Yes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's true. And with those two words, everything Sarah thought she knew about her life, her love, her future, unraveled completely. The man's voice, calm and resigned now, broke the heavy silence that followed. I loved him, Sarah, and I thought we were going to build a life together. But he left me without a word. For her. He gestured toward Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something harder, something that resembled fury. Sarah stood there, unable to move, unable to speak, as the weight of the truth crashed down on her. The dream wedding, the future she had been so sure of, was nothing more than an illusion. Jack wasn't who he said he was. He was a man who had betrayed someone who had loved him. And now, standing in front of her, was the ghost of his past. An angry, broken soul who had once been Jack's everything. As the man's words sank in, Sarah felt her world crumble beneath her. Her love for Jack was now tainted by the truth, and the perfect life she had imagined was shattered in an instant. She had to make a choice, to trust the man she thought she knew or to walk away from everything she thought was real. But as the silence stretched on, Sarah knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the church was suffocating, as if the air itself had grown too thick to breathe. The moment Jack spoke, his voice so fragile and hesitant, Sarah's entire world seemed to shift beneath her. Her legs felt like jelly, and the floor beneath her seemed to tilt, threatening to give way. She gripped the altar tightly, trying to hold herself up, but it felt like the ground was crumbling away from beneath her feet. Sarah, Jack began, his voice barely audible. This is Caleb. He's my partner. We've been together for years. The words were a knife to her heart. Her mind couldn't quite process them, couldn't make sense of what she was hearing. Jack, the man she had trusted with her heart, her future, her dreams, he was confessing his love for another man. Right here, right now. On their wedding day, the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of their happily ever after. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as the truth began to sink in. Caleb, the man standing before her with his fiery eyes and deep pain, wasn't a stranger at all. He was a part of Jack's life, a part Jack had kept hidden, locked away from everyone, including her. And now, as the pieces began to fit together, Sarah could see it all. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the moments when Jack's eyes would wander, distant and lost, as if he were somewhere far away, somewhere that didn't include her. Her head spun as she tried to make sense of it. She had loved Jack with every fiber of her being. She had imagined a life with him, built plans, made promises. And now, with just a few devastating words, all of it had unraveled. Jack's gaze shifted to the floor, and Sarah could see the shame in his eyes. The guilt was written all over him, but there was something else too. Something she couldn't name. Fear? Regret? Or was it relief? Relief that the truth was finally out, that the secret he'd carried for so long was no longer buried? Jack, what are you saying? Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke, the words barely forming in her throat. She felt as though her entire world had just been ripped apart, and now all she could do was stand there, helpless and broken. Jack finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, his face pale, his expression tortured. I didn't want this to happen, Sarah, he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could just keep it all inside, that I could marry you and somehow make it work. But I couldn't. I couldn't live a lie anymore. I love you, Sarah, but I also love Caleb, and I don't know how to fix this. The words tumbled out in a broken, incoherent mess, each one feeling like a punch to Sarah's gut. He loved her, but he loved Caleb too, And now she was standing here, hearing the man she had wanted to spend her life with admit that he had been living in two worlds at once, one with her and one with Caleb. Caleb, who had been standing silently, his fists clenched at his sides, finally spoke up. His voice was raw, filled with a quiet pain that seemed to come from deep within. "Sarah," he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers, "I never wanted to be the one to ruin your life. I never wanted to come here and destroy everything. But I couldn't let Jack marry you without you knowing the truth. He deserves to be honest with you. He deserves to be with the person he truly loves." His voice faltered, and for a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "And so do you, Sarah." The weight of Caleb's words hit Sarah with a force she wasn't prepared for. She had thought she knew what love was. She had thought she knew what trust was. But now, in this cold, unforgiving church, all of that was called into question. Was love enough? Was trust enough? Or was there something deeper that no one had ever told her about? The room seemed to close in around her as she stood there, numb. Her hands were shaking, her legs barely holding her up. She felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare, one where everything she had believed in had been turned upside down. The man she was about to marry had betrayed her in a way that she couldn't even begin to understand. He had kept secrets from her, secrets that had now been laid bare in front of everyone she cared about. Her friends, her family, the guests, they were all watching her, waiting for her to react, to make sense of it all. But she couldn't. You love him?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. She looked between Jack and Caleb, both men standing there, so different yet so connected. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her, and she was floating in an endless void, unsure of where to land. Jack's eyes were filled with tears now, and he nodded slowly. "I do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah. I never meant to. But I couldn't keep living a lie. I couldn't keep pretending that this..." He gestured between him and Caleb. "This wasn't real." Sarah's chest tightened, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to force them both to explain how they could do this to her, how Jack could betray her like this, standing in front of her on what should have been the happiest day of her life. But instead, all she could do was stand there, frozen. Her vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes, her heart aching with a pain she had never known before. She had always believed in their love, in the life they would build together. But now, that belief was shattered, broken into 1,000 pieces. The future she had imagined was gone. And in its place was a stark, painful truth she wasn't ready to face. For a long moment, Sarah stood there in the deafening silence, her mind racing, her heart broken. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do. All she could do was try to breathe, to take in the overwhelming weight of the moment. And then, with a voice that barely broke the silence, she whispered, "I don't know what to do. I don't know who you are anymore." Jack flinched at the words, and for a brief second, Sarah saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the desperate longing for forgiveness. But it was too late. The truth was out. The wedding, the life they had planned, the love she thought she had, it was all gone. And nothing, not even Jack's broken words, could ever put it back together again. The church was still, the air heavy with disbelief. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at any of them. Not at Jack, who was standing there, looking as broken as she felt, nor at Caleb, who seemed to share the same grief. She couldn't stay, not in that room filled with their pain and her own. It was too much, too raw, too real. Her legs, once steady and poised for a future she thought she was about to walk into, now betrayed her. Her body trembled uncontrollably, as if it had no idea how to hold itself together anymore. With a sharp, desperate intake of breath, she turned and ran. She didn't care that her wedding dress, a thing of beauty and elegance just moments ago, now dragged behind her like a weight, a reminder of everything that had been taken from her. She didn't care that her heels slapped against the polished church floors, echoing with the sound of her breaking heart. The only thing that mattered in that moment was escape. Escape from the lies, the broken promises, the betrayal. Escape from the life she had thought she knew. As she burst through the doors, the cool evening air hit her like a slap, and the city streets stretched out in front of her, endless and indifferent. It was as though the world around her had continued to move forward while hers had come to a screeching halt. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the chaos in her mind. She had no destination, no plan. All she knew was that she couldn't stay there. Not there, not where her world had just crumbled. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after something violent had passed through, an unsettling silence that swallowed everything whole. As Sarah's feet carried her forward, faster and faster, the world began to blur around her. Her vision became hazy, her breath ragged and desperate as the tears streamed down her face. She couldn't stop them. They were relentless, pouring out of her like the very essence of her heartbreak. It was as though her body had to release it all, or it would never survive. She ran without thinking, her thoughts swirling in a storm of disbelief and hurt. How could Jack do this to her? How could he betray her in the most public way possible, shattering everything she had believed about their love? He had promised her forever. Forever. But forever was a lie, a shattered illusion she had carried like a precious thing, now broken beyond repair. Her pace slowed as she reached a small park, the only refuge her feet seemed to know. She staggered to a bench and collapsed onto it, her sobs so deep and primal that they shook her entire body. She bent forward, her hands clutching her dress, as if she could somehow hold herself together, as if she could somehow stop the pain from consuming her. Her sobs echoed in the night, the sound of a broken heart reverberating in the stillness. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in the rawness of her emotions. The world around her seemed so distant, so uncaring. The streetlights flickered above her, their light casting long shadows over the empty park. There was no one there to see her, to hold her, to offer comfort. She was alone, more alone than she had ever felt in her life. As the tears slowly subsided, Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand, her cheeks stained with the evidence of her pain. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't care. Nothing mattered anymore. She had trusted Jack, had believed in their love, and now that belief had been ripped away from her in the cruelest of ways. The night stretched on, silent and unforgiving. And in the quiet, Sarah's thoughts began to circle back to Caleb. She hadn't even looked at him, hadn't truly seen him until now. The anger and the hurt she had felt toward him were still there, but now there was something else, something unexpected, sympathy. He had been hurt too. He had loved Jack too. And in a twisted way, they were both victims of a man who had tried to live in two worlds at once, a man who had never given either of them the respect or honesty they deserved. Sarah's chest tightened at the thought. Jack hadn't just lied to her. He had lied to Caleb too. The man she had loved wasn't the only one suffering. Caleb was hurting too, and for a moment, Sarah felt a fleeting sense of understanding. But it was fleeting. The truth was, she couldn't think about Caleb now. She couldn't think about anyone but herself. She had to figure out how to heal from this, how to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around her, and for a moment, Sarah let herself be lost in the sound. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind, to focus on something, anything, that would pull her away from the suffocating pain that threatened to consume her. She wasn't ready to face what had just happened. She wasn't ready to face Jack, or Caleb, or the world that had so suddenly turned upside down. She didn't know what the future held. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. Not yet. Not when the echoes of that church and the words Jack had spoken still haunted her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah realized that it was hers to choose. She didn't need Jack. She didn't need Caleb. She only needed herself. And with that thought, she stood up from the bench, wiping away the last of her tears. The night was still, the city lights distant, and the world felt oddly empty. But she was done running. It was time to face the truth, and maybe one day learn to live again. Sarah sat in the darkened park, her mind spinning in 1,000 directions, unable to make sense of anything that had just happened. The weight of the evening felt unbearable, as if the entire world had collapsed in on her all at once. Her wedding, her love, the future she had envisioned, all of it had shattered in a matter of minutes. The ache in her chest was a constant reminder of the betrayal, the confusion, the sense of having been duped by the man she had trusted most. The stillness of the night wrapped around her like a cold, suffocating blanket. The park, once a peaceful escape she had visited countless times, now felt foreign and alien. The quiet was deafening, and with every breath she took, Sarah felt the sharp sting of the reality she was facing. She had been left alone in this chaos, abandoned in her heartbreak. It was all too much, and yet it was happening, and she couldn't stop it. Just as she thought she might disappear into the darkness, she heard footsteps. Quick, urgent, yet familiar. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. A voice called her name softly, hesitantly. Sarah? She didn't respond at first. She couldn't. She wasn't sure if she even had the strength to face anyone, to look them in the eyes. She had been embarrassed enough, humiliated enough in front of the entire church. But then, the voice came again, this time closer. Sarah? It's me, Laura. Sarah finally lifted her head, blinking through the tears that hadn't stopped falling. She saw her best friend, Laura, standing before her, her face a mask of concern and confusion. Laura had been her maid of honor, standing by her side just hours ago, in a moment that now felt like a lifetime ago. Her presence was a relief, a small comfort, and yet Sarah felt herself crumbling even more. How could she explain all of this? How could she begin to make sense of it for someone else when she hadn't even been able to do that for herself? Laura took a cautious step forward, her voice gentle but full of concern. I was looking for you. I couldn't find you after. She paused, the words hanging heavy between them. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I can't even imagine what you're going through. Tears pooled in Sarah's eyes once more, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to say something, wanted to scream, to ask why, to demand answers from Jack and from the world itself. But she couldn't find the words. Instead, all she could do was let herself fall into Laura's arms, the comforting embrace of her best friend, the only thing anchoring her to reality. Laura held her tightly, her hand rubbing soothing circles on Sarah's back, whispering comforting words into her ear, though none of them seemed to reach Sarah's soul. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I can't believe he did this to you. You didn't deserve this. The warmth of Laura's hug, the steady presence of her best friend, felt like a small, fragile lifeline, but the pain was still there, deep and consuming. Why didn't he tell me, Laura? Sarah's voice broke as she spoke, her words thick with grief. Why did he lie to me? How could he do this? Laura didn't have an answer. She couldn't offer a solution to this kind of betrayal. No one could. All she could do was hold Sarah, offering what little comfort she had, hoping it would be enough to help her through the worst of the storm. I don't know, Sarah, Laura whispered, her own heart aching for her friend. I don't know why he kept this from you. But you need to know one thing. You're stronger than this. I know it feels like everything's falling apart, but you are so much stronger than you realize. But even as Laura spoke those words, Sarah felt herself breaking into a million pieces. Stronger? She didn't feel strong. She felt hollow, like a shell of the person she had been just hours before. How could she ever move forward from this? How could she trust again? How could she ever heal from the devastation Jack had caused her? Look at me, Sarah. Laura gently cupped her friend's face, lifting her chin so their eyes met. You are going to get through this. I promise you, you will. You have to lean on the people who care about you now, and I will be here every step of the way as you heal. Sarah's breath hitched in her chest. She knew Laura meant every word, but the weight of the pain still pressed on her heart. She wanted to believe that someday, somehow, she would be able to move on from this. But for now, all she could do was let the tears fall. Let the heartbreak wash over her and cling to the comfort of her friend's arms, because in this moment, that was all she could hold on to. I don't even know who I am anymore, Laura, Sarah murmured, her voice small. I thought I knew everything. I thought I knew him. I thought we had it all. And now, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Laura gently wiped the tears from Sarah's cheeks, her voice filled with a quiet determination. You're still you. You're not defined by this, Sarah. I know it feels like the end of the world, but it's just the beginning of something new. And together, we'll figure it out, one step at a time. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing the words to sink in, even though the pain still seemed unbearable. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how she would ever heal from the devastation of this night. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't have to face it alone. Not if she had Laura by her side. And for the first time since the wedding had fallen apart, Sarah felt the tiniest glimmer of hope flicker inside her, a fragile spark that, just maybe, would one day light the way forward. The days after the wedding were a blur for Sarah. The apartment she had once shared with Jack, now a place of haunting memories, felt like a prison. She locked herself away, retreating from the world, unable to face anyone, least of all Jack. The betrayal had left a deep wound, and every passing hour seemed to deepen the ache in her chest. She couldn't find peace. Not with the unanswered questions swirling in her mind, not with the lingering echo of Jack's confession. Laura had stayed by her side through the silence, comforting her when the grief became overwhelming, listening to her cry when words failed. But even Laura knew that Sarah couldn't keep hiding forever. The questions, the pain, the confusion, it was eating away at her. Eventually, Sarah had come to a decision. She needed to confront Jack. She needed answers, no matter how much it hurt. "I can't keep running from this, Laura," Sarah whispered one afternoon, her voice hoarse from too many tears. "I need to understand why he did this. I need to know why he lied to me for all these years." Laura had nodded, her eyes understanding. "I know. And I'll be with you. We'll go together, okay?" Together, they drove back to the church. The place that had once symbolized hope, love, and a new beginning for Sarah now felt like a graveyard of her dreams. It was still early in the morning, the streets quiet and empty, but Sarah's heart was a storm of emotions. Her hands shook on the steering wheel, and as they pulled into the parking lot, the weight of what she was about to do settled over her like a heavy fog. She was about to face the two people who had shattered her world, to seek the answers that had eluded her. The church stood before her like a cold, indifferent monument. The tall doors loomed, a silent reminder of the day that had started as her dream wedding and ended as her worst nightmare. Sarah's heart thudded painfully against her ribcage, but she stepped out of the car, determined. She wasn't going to leave without some kind of closure. Inside, the church was empty, save for Jack and Caleb. They stood near the altar, talking in hushed voices. Jack's eyes flickered up as Sarah entered, his face immediately twisting with regret. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face drawn and weary. Caleb, standing beside him, looked equally drained, his eyes shadowed with guilt. Neither of them seemed surprised to see Sarah, but the tension in the air was thick, palpable. "Sarah," Jack began, his voice faltering as he stepped toward her. I didn't expect you to come back here." Sarah's eyes narrowed, the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I couldn't let it go, Jack. I need answers. I need to understand why you lied to me for so long." Her voice shook with barely contained fury, but beneath that anger was the deep pain of betrayal. Jack swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair as he took a deep breath. He seemed torn, unsure how to explain the mess he had created. I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah," he said quietly. "I was afraid of losing you. I thought if I could convince you that everything was fine, that I could be happy with you. I thought maybe it would be enough." His words came out in a rush, as though he had been carrying this burden for far too long. But it wasn't enough, and it was never going to be. Caleb, standing a few steps behind Jack, spoke next, his voice softer but steady. "Jack didn't just lie to you, Sarah. He lied to himself. We've been together for years, and he kept trying to push that part of himself away because he didn't want to hurt you." He met Sarah's gaze, his expression serious. "Our love was real, but Jack convinced himself that he could live without it. He thought he could just walk away from me and find happiness with you. And for a while, I think he even convinced himself he could." Sarah's mind spun, each word cutting deeper than the last. "So, this whole time, all those years we spent together, all the plans we made, you were lying to me? You were never really in love with me, were you, Jack?" Jack's face crumpled, guilt flooding his features as he struggled to find the right words. "No, I was in love with you, Sarah. I thought I could make it work. But when Caleb came back into my life, I realized I couldn't keep pretending." His voice broke. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought if I just went through with the wedding, maybe everything would work out. But it didn't." The weight of his confession hung in the air, suffocating Sarah. She couldn't breathe, couldn't comprehend the depth of what Jack was saying. He had lied to her. He had spent years with her, making promises, building a future, and all the while, he had known, He had known that he couldn't be the man she needed him to be. How could she have missed it? How could she have been so blind? Why didn't you tell me the truth, Jack? Sarah's voice trembled, raw with the pain of it all. Why didn't you just tell me? Why lead me on for so long? Why let me fall in love with you if you didn't love me the way I loved you? Jack's eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw the man she had once loved, the man who had seemed so perfect, so right for her. But that man was gone now, replaced by a stranger, someone who had betrayed her in the worst way. I was scared, Sarah, Jack admitted, his voice breaking. I was scared that if I told you the truth, I would lose everything. I thought I could be happy with you, but I couldn't. And in the end, it wasn't fair to either of us. Caleb's expression softened, but there was no excuse for Jack's actions. The truth had to be spoken, no matter how much it hurt. You deserve better than this, Caleb said gently. Neither of us should have done this to you. Sarah stood there, numb, as the weight of their words settled over her. This wasn't just betrayal. It was an entire life built on lies, and now it was all crashing down around her. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But I needed to hear it. I needed to know the truth. Jack and Caleb stood there in silence, the tension heavy between them. But for Sarah, the answers had come, and now she had a choice. She could stay in this place of anger and hurt, or she could find the strength to move on. But in that moment, standing in the church that had once represented everything she had hoped for, Sarah knew that the path forward would not be easy. The truth had been laid bare, and now she had to rebuild, piece by painful piece. The question was, could she ever trust again? The silence that followed was suffocating. Jack and Caleb stood before Sarah, waiting for her response, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. The weight of everything that had been revealed crushed her, and yet there was a part of her still clinging to the hope that somehow, some part of the truth could be different, less painful. But deep down, Sarah knew there was no escaping the reality of it. Jack had betrayed her, and Caleb, who had once been a stranger in her life, had become an unwelcome reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I don't know what to say, Sarah whispered, her voice fragile, barely above a breath. You should have told me from the start. The words tumbled out, full of pain and accusation, but there was no anger in her voice now, just exhaustion, a raw ache that seeped into her bones. Jack opened his mouth to speak again, but he faltered, unable to find the right words. He looked at her with eyes filled with regret, but the damage was done. The life they had built, the future they had dreamed of, now felt like an illusion. Every promise he had made to her, every shared laugh, every whispered, "I love you," now seemed hollow and meaningless. How could she ever believe in anything he said again? Laura, who had been standing a little behind Sarah, her face filled with concern, stepped forward and gently touched Sarah's arm. "What are you going to do now, Sarah?" she asked quietly. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of the question that Sarah herself didn't have an answer to. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah simply stood there, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look at either of the men who had so deeply hurt her. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she couldn't summon the strength to meet them. Her mind was a tangled mess of emotions, each thought and memory colliding with the next. There was so much pain, so much confusion, and yet there was also a sense of disbelief, as though she couldn't fully process what had happened. Could it really be true? Could Jack have been lying to her for so long? She finally took a shaky breath and looked up, meeting Laura's concerned eyes. "I don't know," she whispered. The words felt like an admission of weakness, but Sarah knew it was the truth. How could she possibly know what to do now? She had thought she knew who she was, what she wanted, and who she could trust. But now, everything was uncertain. Her world had been turned upside down, and she was left trying to pick up the shattered pieces. There was a long pause before Caleb spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "Sarah, I don't want you to think that I'm trying to hurt you. I didn't ask for this to happen." His tone was softer now, more regretful, but there was still something in his eyes, a resolve. He had his own pain, but it was different from hers. He wasn't the one left standing at the altar, abandoned in front of their friends and family. He hadn't been the one to believe in a love that had turned out to be nothing but a lie. Sarah felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest as she turned her gaze to him. For the first time, she really looked at Caleb, seeing not just the man who had been Jack's secret partner, but someone who had been caught in this tangled web too. "I didn't ask for any of this either," Sarah said, her voice wavering. She swallowed hard, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to spill over. "But I don't know how to deal with this. With both of you, standing here in front of me, acting like everything's okay." Caleb's face softened, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah saw the kindness in his eyes. He wasn't the enemy in this situation. He was just another victim, caught up in a mess that had spiraled out of control. But it didn't make it any easier. His love for Jack had torn apart her life, and she couldn't just pretend that wasn't true. "I know I can't make things right," Caleb continued, his voice quieter now. "But I hope you can understand that this wasn't about hurting you. I never wanted to be the one to destroy your life. Jack and I, we've been through a lot together, but none of this was your fault." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, taking in his words. There was truth in them, but it didn't change the fact that her entire future had been stolen from her. She had trusted Jack. She had believed in their love, their life together. And now, here she was, standing in front of a man who had deceived her, a man who had promised her forever and broken that promise in the cruelest way imaginable. She felt so small in that moment, so utterly lost. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. "I don't know how to move forward with either of you." The pain of it all seemed unbearable, and for a moment, Sarah felt like she might break into 1,000 pieces right there. She had thought she would walk down the aisle today and begin the happiest chapter of her life. Instead, she was standing in a church, surrounded by two men who had both, in their own ways, shattered her world. "I need time," Sarah said softly, finally gathering enough strength to speak again. Her words were a plea, not just to Jack and Caleb, but to herself. "I need time to figure out who I am without you, Jack. Who I am without all the lies. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive either of you. But I can't keep living in this chaos. I need to heal." Jack looked at her with a broken expression, as though her words had struck him deeper than anything else she could have said. But there was no more room for his apologies, no more space for his regret. Sarah wasn't interested in words anymore, only in finding her own peace. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But this time, Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. There was nothing more to say. She turned away from him, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, and walked toward the door, her mind filled with uncertainty about the future. But one thing was clear. It would be her journey, and hers alone. It had been weeks since Sarah had left the church, weeks since her world had crumbled in front of her, and yet the pain still lingered. Every day was a struggle to get through, a challenge to navigate the mess that Jack and Caleb had left behind. But somehow, Sarah had started to rebuild, piece by fragile piece. She had found solace in the quiet routine of her bookstore job, surrounded by the familiar scent of old pages and the soft murmur of the world outside. But just when Sarah thought she had begun to move on, life had other plans. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Lila first appeared at the bookstore. The bell above the door jingled as the woman stepped inside, her presence almost like a shadow that stretched across the room. Lila was striking, but there was something unsettling about her. Her dark hair cascaded down her back, and her sharp, observant eyes seemed to see right through Sarah as she walked toward the counter. Sarah was shelving a stack of books when Lila spoke, her voice low but steady, as if she had been waiting for the right moment. "I know who you are," Lila said, her gaze intense. "You're Sarah, the one Jack betrayed." The words hit Sarah like a cold gust of wind. She stopped, her hand frozen midair as she turned to face the woman. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice cautious. The last thing she needed was someone else from Jack's life showing up to cause more pain. Lila smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. There was a hint of something dark in her expression. "I don't want to hurt you, Sarah. I'm here to help you." Sarah arched an eyebrow, skeptical. "Help me?" she repeated, crossing her arms defensively. "How?" Lila's eyes flickered to the door, as if ensuring no one else was around. Her voice lowered further, becoming almost a whisper. Jack, he's involved in something much darker than you know, something dangerous. And I think you're in more danger than you realize. The words were so unexpected, so out of the blue, that Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The bookstore suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Lila took a step closer, her eyes locking onto Sarah's. I know you've been hurt, but you deserve to know the truth. Jack has been keeping secrets from you, things he's involved in that go far beyond what you could imagine. He's not just some man who made a mistake. He's dangerous. A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend the weight of Lila's words. Dangerous? She had always known there was something about Jack that didn't add up, something elusive in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. But this was a whole new level of treachery. Was it possible that Jack, the man she had loved and trusted, could be hiding something so sinister? I don't believe you, Sarah said, shaking her head, trying to dismiss the growing fear in her chest. Jack isn't like that. He isn't who you think he is, Lila interrupted, her voice soft but insistent. I've seen him, Sarah. I've seen the things he's done. He's not just a man with a broken heart. He's involved in something bigger, and you're tangled up in it, whether you know it or not. Sarah felt the ground beneath her shift as she listened to Lila's cryptic words. It was hard to accept, to even entertain the idea that the man who had once promised her everything could be a part of something so dangerous. The thought that Jack's betrayal was just the tip of an iceberg of lies and deceit made her stomach churn. What do you want from me? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Why are you telling me this now? Lila took another step closer, her eyes narrowing with urgency. Because you need to know the truth before it's too late. Jack has kept you in the dark for far too long. He's been hiding behind a mask, playing a role that doesn't belong to him. He's involved with people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. And you? She paused, her gaze locking onto Sarah's. You're caught in the middle of it. You've been marked, Sarah. The word marked hung in the air like a curse. Sarah felt her heart race, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. Marked? Was Lila really trying to warn her, or was this some twisted game? It felt like she had stumbled into the middle of a story she wasn't prepared for, a story that threatened to swallow her whole. Why are you telling me this? Sarah repeated, her voice steadier now, though the tremor of fear still lingered. What do you want me to do about it? Lila's face softened, as if the weight of what she was revealing was finally catching up with her. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice quieter now. I'm telling you this because I can't let you be pulled into something that's beyond your control. Jack isn't just hiding from you, Sarah. He's hiding from them, and you deserve the truth before you get dragged deeper into this mess. Sarah stood there, frozen, her thoughts swirling. What was Lila suggesting? Was it possible that Jack was involved in something far more sinister than a love affair gone wrong? Was there a world of danger lurking behind the man she had once loved? How do you know all of this? Sarah asked, her voice now filled with suspicion. Lila's eyes darted around the room before she answered, her voice barely audible. Let's just say I've had dealings with Jack's past. I've seen the darker side of him, and I don't want to see you destroyed by it too. She paused, watching Sarah closely. I can't do this alone, Sarah. I need your help. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Could she trust this woman? Or was this just another piece of the puzzle Jack had woven so carefully around her life? There was only one way to find out. Taking a deep breath, Sarah finally spoke, her voice firm. I don't know if I can trust you, Lila, but I need answers. So, I'll follow you. But you better not be lying to me. Lila nodded, a glint of something dangerous in her eyes. Good. You're making the right choice, Sarah, and this is just the beginning. As Sarah walked out of the bookstore, her heart was pounding. She had no idea what she was getting into, but something deep inside her told her that she needed to uncover the truth. The pieces of her shattered life were slowly coming together, and she wasn't about to let Jack or anyone else hide the truth from her any longer. The evening air was thick with tension as Lila led Sarah down narrow streets, past dark alleyways, and into a hidden door tucked away behind an old, weathered building. The world felt eerily quiet, as though everything in her life had momentarily stopped. Every step she took seemed to echo louder in her ears, a constant reminder of how far she had come, from the peaceful bookstore she had once called home to this unknown world of danger and lies. Lila didn't say much as they walked. Her steps were quick, purposeful, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if they were being followed, if anyone was watching them. But the deeper they ventured, the more it felt like the world outside had vanished entirely. The harsh glow of streetlights was replaced by the dim lighting inside the building they now entered, a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving night. Inside, Sarah was met with an unexpected sight, a group of people sitting around a table, papers scattered before them, their faces tense and serious. Their eyes locked onto Sarah the moment she stepped inside, and Sarah felt the weight of their gaze, as though they were sizing her up, trying to determine if she was an ally or a threat. "Sit," Lila instructed, her voice still calm, yet tinged with urgency. Sarah hesitated but obeyed, sitting down at the far edge of the table. Her hands were cold, trembling slightly as she processed the strangeness of the situation. Lila sat beside her, and the others leaned forward, waiting for the conversation to begin. One of the men, a tall, wiry figure with dark, penetrating eyes, spoke first. "Sarah, I know this is a lot to take in, but we need to tell you the full truth about Jack." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had expected more lies, more manipulation. But this man's voice was different. There was a raw sincerity to it that caught her off guard. She braced herself. "What do you mean? I already know enough. Jack betrayed me." The man nodded, his expression grave. "What you don't know is that Jack's betrayal wasn't personal. It wasn't about love. It was about something much bigger. Something he never wanted you to be a part of." He paused, glancing at the others in the room. "Jack has been working undercover for months. He's been trying to take down a criminal syndicate that's been operating right here in your town." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What are you talking about? Jack? A cop? An undercover agent?" The idea was so far-fetched, so unbelievable, that it seemed impossible. She had always known there was something Jack had kept from her, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. One of the women in the group, a quiet but intense presence, spoke up. "Jack's been working with us. We've been gathering information, infiltrating the organization, trying to bring it down from the inside. But it's a dangerous game, Sarah, and recently, things have gotten messy." Another man, shorter but stockier, added, "We were close. Jack had gathered enough evidence to take them down, but we think they've caught on to him. They know he's been playing them, and now he's in hiding. If we don't find him, this could get much worse." Sarah's head was spinning, her mind struggling to piece together the fragments of truth. Jack, her Jack, the man she had thought was just a regular guy, the man she was about to marry, had been leading a double life. Not just any life, but one full of danger, deceit, and hidden motives. And now, she was caught in the middle of it all. "Wait," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and disbelief. "You're telling me that Jack? He didn't want to hurt me? He was keeping secrets to protect me?" The man who had spoken earlier nodded solemnly. "That's exactly it. He didn't want you to be involved in any of this. He thought that if he kept you in the dark, he could protect you. But the truth is, he never expected this. Never expected you to be pulled into this world of danger." Another woman in the group, her blonde hair tied back tightly, spoke up with a somber expression. "We know this is a lot to take in, but you need to understand, Sarah, that Jack isn't just protecting himself. He's protecting you too. They've marked him, and now they know about you as well. If we don't find him before they do, you'll be in danger too." Sarah's chest tightened, the weight of their words crushing down on her. She had thought the worst thing Jack could do was betray her heart, but now it was clear. The stakes were much higher. She wasn't just a jilted bride. She was a target. "And what do you want me to do about it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can I help? How can I trust you people?" Lila, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up, her voice softer now, but just as urgent. "We need your help, Sarah. We need you to trust us. Jack is close to exposing the truth, but if we don't act fast, everything he's worked for will be destroyed. He might be able to protect himself, but he won't be able to do it alone. You're the key to finding him." Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her like a heavy cloak. She had never signed up for any of this. She had never imagined that her life would spiral into this dark underworld of crime, lies, and danger. But as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, she realized that she couldn't turn back now. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said, her voice small. "But I know one thing. I need to find Jack. I need to understand what he's really been doing. I need to know if he's really the man I thought he was." Lila nodded, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a knowing look. "We'll help you find him. But time is running out. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets." For the first time since everything had gone wrong, Sarah felt a flicker of purpose inside her. She wasn't just some victim of betrayal anymore. She was part of something much larger, something that needed to be stopped. And no matter how complicated or dangerous it was, she was determined to find Jack and to uncover the truth once and for all. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions as she sat with Lila and the others, listening to the plan that had been laid out. She had no idea how to feel. The betrayal, the hurt, the sense of abandonment, it was all still raw. But something in her heart kept her from walking away completely. Perhaps it was the lingering love she still felt for Jack, or maybe it was the realization that the story she thought she knew had only been a small part of the bigger picture. Either way, she knew she couldn't turn her back on him. Not now, not after everything that had happened. Lila, ever the calm strategist, had taken charge. "We've pinpointed Jack's last known location," she said, her voice steady as she laid out the details on a map spread across the table. "He was last seen in an abandoned warehouse just outside of town. We think he was trying to gather evidence when everything went wrong." Sarah stared at the map, her heart pounding. This place, this warehouse, it seemed so ordinary, yet everything about it felt sinister now. It was a symbol of the life Jack had chosen, a life that had led him to keep so many secrets from her, a life that had pulled her into a world she wasn't prepared for. "You're sure he's still there?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her chest tightened as the weight of the situation sank in. She was walking into the unknown, and there was no telling what she might find. Lila nodded, her expression serious. "We think so. His contacts have been trying to reach him, but they haven't had any luck. It's possible that the syndicate already knows about the warehouse and might be keeping an eye on it. That's why we need to move fast." The tension in the room was palpable as everyone gathered their things, preparing for the journey. But despite the urgency, Sarah felt a deep hesitation. Her mind kept circling back to Jack, his lies, his secret life. She wanted to believe he had a good reason for hiding things from her, for putting her in this dangerous position, but the hurt was still there. How could he have kept something so big from her? How could he have risked her safety, her trust, for so long? As they left the safe house and headed towards the warehouse, Sarah's thoughts were a jumble. The car ride was silent. The only sound, the hum of the engine, and the occasional rustle of papers as Lila and the others discussed their next steps. Sarah's gaze drifted out the window, watching the city blur by. She had always loved this town, the coffee shops, the little bookstores, the quiet parks. Now everything seemed tainted by the darkness Jack had been entangled in, a darkness that stretched far beyond what she had ever imagined. "Are you okay?" Lila's voice broke through her thoughts, soft yet steady. Sarah turned to her, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "I don't know," she admitted. "I keep telling myself this isn't my fight, that I should walk away. But I can't. I can't just pretend like none of this matters. Jack, he's not the man I thought he was. But he's also not a villain. I know that. I just don't know how to reconcile that with everything that's happened." Lila nodded, understanding more than Sarah realized. "It's not easy," she said quietly. "But sometimes you have to look at the bigger picture. Jack didn't want to drag you into this world, but he also didn't want to lose you. He thought by keeping you safe from it all, you'd never have to know. But now you're in this whether you want to be or not. And the only way out is to face it head on." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It was hard to admit, but Lila was right. This wasn't just Jack's problem anymore. It was hers too. She had been thrust into this world by the man she loved, and she couldn't walk away without knowing the full truth. She couldn't let the anger, the betrayal, blind her to the reality of the situation. When they arrived at the warehouse, the air felt heavy with expectation. The building loomed before them, dark and imposing against the backdrop of a starless sky. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and its walls streaked with grime. But Sarah knew better than to trust appearances. This place held secrets, and she was about to uncover them. As they approached the entrance, Sarah felt the weight of what she was about to do press down on her chest. This was it. There was no turning back. She wasn't just going to confront Jack. She was going to confront the life he had kept hidden from her. The life that had led him to keep her in the dark. The life that had put them both in danger. Lila, ever the leader, gave a quick nod, signaling to the others to spread out and search the area. Sarah followed her, her heart racing. She couldn't help but glance around, half expecting someone to jump out at any moment. But it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. It felt like they were walking into a trap, but Sarah had no choice but to press on. As they entered the dimly lit interior of the warehouse, the musty smell of dust and decay hit her. The only sound was the creaking of the old building as they moved deeper into the shadows. Sarah's breath quickened as she scanned the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner. "Jack?" she called out softly, her voice echoing through the empty space. There was no response. Her heart sank. Where was he? Was he already gone? Or worse, had something happened to him? But then a faint noise caught her attention. A footstep, barely audible against the silence. Sarah's eyes locked onto the source, her pulse quickening. Someone was here, someone who knew they were coming. "Stay alert," Lila whispered, her tone serious. The team moved closer, ready for whatever might come next. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as a figure stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't Jack. Instead, it was someone she hadn't expected, a man who looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place him. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know what you're looking for, but you're too late." Sarah's stomach twisted as the words sank in. This man knew something, and whatever it was about to change everything. The warehouse was eerily quiet, its dark interior stretching out like a vast, empty void. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last as she stepped deeper into the shadows. The weight of the past few weeks, the lies, the betrayal, the revelations, pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. Yet, beneath the anger and confusion, a flicker of something else stirred within her. The same love she had once felt for Jack. It had never fully disappeared, not even after everything. She wasn't sure what that meant anymore, but she knew she had to face him. She had to hear him out, even if it was the hardest thing she would ever do. As they moved further into the warehouse, the silence became unbearable, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet on the dusty floor. The place was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her. She could feel Lila's eyes on her, steady and supportive, but even the familiar presence of her friend couldn't calm the storm brewing inside her. Then, as if the world had shifted in an instant, a figure appeared in the dim light. At first, Sarah wasn't sure if her mind was playing tricks on her, but as the figure stepped forward, she knew it was Jack. His face was gaunt, his clothes rumpled as though he hadn't slept in days. His once immaculate appearance had given way to exhaustion and strain. His eyes, though still the same blue she remembered, were hollow, filled with regret and sorrow. He moved toward her, but she didn't take a step forward to meet him. She couldn't. The chasm between them felt too wide, too deep to bridge with a simple movement. "Sarah," Jack's voice was raw, barely a whisper, but it pierced the stillness of the warehouse. "I didn't think you'd come. I didn't think you'd want to see me after everything. But I had to see you. I had to apologize, even if it doesn't mean anything anymore." Sarah stood frozen, her body stiff with emotion, as her mind raced to process the sight of him standing there, so close, yet so far away. She felt a pang of longing, but it was overshadowed by the flood of anger and hurt that rose up inside her. This man, the man she had planned to marry, had lied to her for months, keeping secrets, hiding a dangerous life from her. He had pulled her into a world of danger and deception, and now he stood before her, broken and apologetic. Could she ever forgive him? Could she ever trust him again? "I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah," Jack continued, his voice breaking as his eyes searched hers for some sign, any sign that she still cared. I thought I could protect you by keeping you out of this. I thought if I kept you in the dark, you'd be safe, but I was wrong. I made the biggest mistake of my life by pushing you away and lying to you. You deserve the truth. You deserve better. Sarah felt the sting of his words, the finality in them. The truth. The truth that had been hidden from her for so long. The truth that had shattered everything she thought she knew about him, about their life together. She had spent so many nights imagining this moment, replaying the conversation she would have with him in her mind. But now, standing here, with all the pain and confusion swirling around her, she didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to feel. I trusted you, she said, her voice steady despite the tears that burned behind her eyes. I trusted you with everything, Jack. I gave you my heart, and you shattered it. You kept so much from me, and now you expect me to just forgive you? Jack flinched at her words, but he didn't back away. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of his mistakes was too much to carry. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the ground. I don't deserve it, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you, if you'll let me. For a long moment, Sarah didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, suffocating in its intensity. Her heart was torn in two, one part of her screaming to run, to leave this nightmare behind, and the other part, the part that still loved him, yearning to reach out and hold him, to believe that he was truly sorry. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. How am I supposed to trust you again? She whispered, her voice barely audible. How am I supposed to believe that you won't lie to me again? Jack's eyes lifted to meet hers, and in them, she saw something she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. Real, raw vulnerability. I can't ask you to trust me right now, he said. I know I've broken that, but I can show you, every day. I'll prove to you that I'm not the man who hurt you. I'll prove to you that I can be the man you deserve. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to hold on to her composure. But it was so hard. The love she had for Jack, the hope she had held onto for so long, was all tangled up in the mess of their reality. I don't know if I can do this, she said softly, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can move past everything. For the first time, Jack stepped closer, his hand reaching out, but he stopped short, giving her the space she needed. I'm not asking you to forget, he said gently. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. We can't undo the past, but we can start over, if you're willing to try. Sarah's chest ached as she looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in what felt like forever. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. And in that moment, something shifted. She couldn't erase the pain, couldn't ignore the past, but she also knew that her heart wasn't ready to let go of him entirely. She had always believed in the possibility of redemption, of second chances. I don't know what's next, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely a whisper as she took a hesitant step toward him. But I'll need time. I'll need space to think. And if you really want to fix this, you'll have to prove it to me, Jack. Every day. Jack nodded, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. I'll do whatever it takes. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Sarah felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. It wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be filled with hard work, healing, and the painful yet necessary journey of rebuilding what had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. But for now, it was enough to know they had both taken the first step. As Sarah stood before Jack, emotions swirling inside her, she realized something profound. This wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new. The road to healing wouldn't be easy. Trust had been shattered, hearts had been broken, but there was a spark of hope, faint but undeniable. Jack's confession, his regret, and the journey they had ahead gave her a glimmer of possibility. It wasn't the perfect ending she had once dreamed of, but perhaps it was a better story, a story of resilience, forgiveness, and finding strength in the most unexpected places. With one final glance at Jack, Sarah turned and stepped into the future, her heart still bruised but not broken. And as she walked forward, she knew that, step by step, she could rebuild not just with Jack, but with herself. Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with anyone who might need a little inspiration. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. What did you think of Sarah's journey? How would you have handled things differently? Your feedback means everything to us. Until next time, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next video.